As a reflection of Bethesda's understanding of what makes a great VR port, and a possible reflection of the quality of the run ahead, my first challenge run in Skyrim VR started just about as well as you would expect it to. I have strong VR legs. I don't mind getting whipped and thrown around every which way in VR as long as I get an occasional break. Yet something about floating 5 feet above a cart moving perpendicular to the direction I loaded in facing didn't sit quite right with my inner ear. Because of this, I spent most of Skyrim's famous introductory cart ride with my eyes shut, preparing my mind and my body for the challenge ahead. When you're not being forced to stand around and wait for scripted set pieces to play out and moved against your will, Skyrim VR is an excellent way to relive an iconic game in the most immersive way possible outside of a brain-computer interface. My previous experience with Skyrim's VR port has been mostly pleasant, and I've been wowed by the scale of venues and vistas that I've spent hundreds of hours gawking at on a flat screen more times than I can count. Because of this, I decided to ask myself a reasonable and interesting question. Can you beat Skyrim VR as a gnome? Despite never seeing more than my character's chin for the rest of the run, I saw fit to create a Nord with as many gnome-like features as I could. I named him after the main character of my favorite animated movie of all time, and found myself wading through an execution that played out just as well as the buggy ride. Playing Skyrim in VR has its pros and cons. The increased freedom of movement during scripted segments helps keep me from getting bored, but the mods that allowed me to do so also broke any sense of suspense built up by my brush with the executioner's axe. While the VRIK mod might drastically improve the player's immersion by allowing them to see their entire body, it doesn't seem to play well with scripted animations. Fortunately, most of Skyrim's scripted animations are environmental. Once Ralof freed me from my bindings, I was finally able to take on my true form. The previously mentioned VRIK mod allows players to see their body in VR, a feature that Bethesda really should have included in the base game. Like any good mod, I was able to tweak VRIK to fit my preferences, which in this case meant shrinking my body down to a more gnome-like stature. I briefly considered giving myself massive mitts, but something about going back and renaming my character Mr. Hands didn't quite seem right, so I settled on making my hands and arms match the rest of my body. This challenge ran into an issue that most VR challenges lend themselves to. It's hard to get the sense of scale that VR provides across to the viewers on a flat screen. The size of objects that normally fit in my palm dwarfing my hands helps get the change in scale across to the viewer. But it should still be noted that everything from this point onwards felt huge. Most conversations saw me gawking up at whoever I was talking to, and the shock of giant enemies rushing at me took a while to get used to. Another important mod that is necessary for any playthrough, Gnome or not, is the Higgs mod. Higgs stands for Hand Integration and Gravity Gloves, which, as you might have already guessed, adds hand interactions and what are essentially gravity gloves to Skyrim. Early on, I decided that I would need to invest in a magic build, opting to finally set aside Old Faithful in favor of, well, the other Old Faithful. My all too familiar surroundings now towered over me everywhere I went, and all of the nooks and crannies and now giant boulders I would come across could be harboring any combination of eldritch horrors or undead threats. Magic, much like the Colt 45, is the great equalizer, allowing a person of any stature to have a chance to defend themselves from threats, big and small. Once we finally exited Helgen's cave system, and in turn the game's intro, Ralof and I hid under a rock as Alduin flew overhead, and I found myself just as impressed with the view before me as I was back in 2011. The forest towered over me as I made my way to the first standing stones of the run. I chose the Mage Stone to help me level up whatever magic I ended up using slightly faster, and found myself once again looking up at whoever I held conversation with. The trouble with getting the side eye from everyone you talk to is that it can be hard to read the more subtle signals of conversation. I misread the cues I was picking up from a conversation with Ralof's sister, and stole his brother-in-law's best wine. I was finally able to live out my dream of being a real loot goblin. Every gold coin I picked up was as big as my face, and my stature made finding gold all the more exciting. Sometimes familiarity can be comforting. Despite the added dimension that VR provides and my decreased stature, I was still playing Skyrim in all of its buggy glory. Like many previous playthroughs, I opted to swing by Bleak Falls Barrows and grab the Dragonstone before heading to Whiterun. The first bandits I encountered put up a fair fight, but my nimble gnome hands made short work of their pathetic iron armor. I quickly found myself on Bleak Falls Stoop, and was entertained when I caught a glimpse of my baby shadow for the first time. My arachnophobia didn't extend to my in-game exploits, because I'm not a pussy, and Arvil the Swift was too slow to escape my spicy hands. Fate found the first Draugr of the run already resting in an oven, and the rest of his kin put up a pitiful fight. Despite my overfamiliarity with Bleak Falls layout, I still took time to appreciate the carefully crafted atmosphere of its final chamber. I found the malnourished thief of the Dragonstone and opted to pardon him.
From life.
By the time I made my way back to Riverwood, the townspeople had all hit the hay for the night. So, like a good gnome, I rested on the nearest stoop I could find and returned the Golden Claw to Nick Valentine in the morning. My next stop was Dragon's Reach, a fair distance away for my poor little legs. The journey ended up being worth it, however, when I discovered a burgeoning propensity for large women. Dragon's Reach, and to a lesser extent Whiterun, sacrificed a touch of its familiarity thanks to my new stature. The already grand hall felt a little grander as its mighty pillars leered over me, and I couldn't help treating the Jarl with the respect that this grand hall demanded. The first child I came across surprised me twice, first with his height, and second with his opinion of my fit. I stood the sight of a strong Nord woman, and made a note to remind myself to buy a horse the next time I swung by the Whiterun stables. My poor gnome nubs were starting to get sore from all the walking Skyrim's main quest demanded. My first encounter with the dragon ended with little flourish, and I was shocked to discover that I was not the Dragonborn after all. With the sting of my defeat at the hands of the Dragon Bush still fresh on my mind, I took a moment on the outskirts of Whiterun to steel myself against the challenges ahead. The court really didn't like me bringing news of dragons returning and the prowess of the Dragon Bush, so they punished me by pawning off the most boring follower in the game and sending me on my way. Two exciting things happened as I exited the city. I ran into strange men with curved swords, believe it or not, and I took the time to level up for the first time. For the rest of the run, I would dump every level up into the Magicka skill. I shelled out the shekels for a horse, a necessary purchase. My limited stature made trekking across the map rather tedious, and the horse cut down on my travel time significantly. I stopped by Riverwood to see if Nick had any useful spells for me, and ran across a fellow horse enjoyer. In a rather tragic set of circumstances, my horse flubbed its footing during its first and last mountain climbing expedition, and I once again found myself on foot. Rorikstead helped me through my grief with its beautiful flora and view of the tallest mountain in Skyrim, and saw me promising a rather unnerving fellow that I would help deliver food to the equally creepy old men at the top of the mountain. When he didn't give me any supplies to bring to the hermits, I assumed that responsibility fell on me. I settled on a good barbecue, a dish even the most reclusive hermit couldn't turn down. Once I dropped off the creepy man's supplies, I met the Greybeards, who had a rather uncomfortable habit of doing whatever that is. They sent me off on an errand. After getting an eyeful of a little more kitty than I would prefer, I made my way through another dungeon in search of some horny guy named Jurgen Windcaller, or something like that. I wasn't paying attention. Like all things in life, the dungeon eventually evolved into Crab, and I discovered that the princess was in another castle. Unfortunately, the other castle was a dingy hotel room, and the princess was a stupid fucking donkey who refused to get out of the doorway. Delphine had enough of Lydia's BS and gave me a jump scare. She led me down to her weeb basement and sent me back up to the rude old men that insisted on sharing their creepy fairy dust with me, whether I wanted it or not. After their initiation ritual, I put more points into my Magicka bar and got revenge on a third of my comment section. The second dragon of the run opted to freeze its foes instead of burning them, and the third clawed its way out of a tomb and into my heart. As I soaked in the sights on my way back to Whiterun, I decided that it was finally time to start making progress on leveling up my character. I bought 3 spells from Farengar, the most important being Muffle. In my experience, getting your hands on Muffle as early into the run as you can is an essential step in any mage build's road to greatness. You can cast Muffle as you make your way from location to location, passively leveling up Illusion, one of the most OP forms of magic in the game. Despite its tried and true status, doing so is cheaper and faster than crafting a shitload of iron daggers. One of the youngest denizens of Riverwood reinforced how important it is to level up your magicka skills, and I went on to take out my frustration over my magical ineptitude on a gang of peak specimens of evolutionary power. Solitude was as beautiful as ever, and approaching it from a different direction than normal led me to appreciate its grandeur all the more. Inside its mighty walls, my endless and incessant search for Head was briefly satisfied, and I dropped off the supplies I'd like to get back to me once I snuck into the Thalmore's private party. Melbourne gave me unwelcome advice,
your job is to get into the party without being fingered,
and I leveled up both my illusion and character once more before donning my party fit. I encountered a bit of visual whiplash when I introduced myself to Chris Jenner's Elfsona and snuck into the storage closet with Finger McGee to grab my stash of tasty drinks. I found myself in an advantageous position when sneaking around the tall Thalmore. My tiny stature allowed me to quickly and subtly dispatch them from a distance. I channeled my best Dave Bautista impression and broke into the Thalmore's torture chambers. My inner Mike Pence surfaced for a moment, and I freed a man with 2 caterpillars glued to his brow. The Thalmore continued to prove that they have the funniest ragdolls, and I encountered an all too familiar sight when I returned to Delphine. As I grabbed my gear and took off my party apparel, I noticed something about the blade swords that worried me. Before I could put too much thought into what they reminded me of, a random challenger approached looking for an honorable duel. I generously obliged, and made my way back to Solitude in search of better robes. Unfortunately, Tamriel was closer to real life than I originally thought. Inflation was running rampant through Skyrim. Fortunately, like real life, all one has to do is steal from the rich with reality-bending exploits. I picked up a better fit and grabbed every spellbook I could get my tiny hands on. Also, like real life, I planted the rest of my stolen goods on an unfortunate minimum wage worker and let them take the heat for my crime. With crime on my mind, I stopped by Riften in search of an old man living in the sewers. Before I could get to him, I tried to repent for some of my sins and donated to the poor, something that Riften natives didn't seem to appreciate. I also ditched the donkey woman for a fellow magician, gaining a follower that would risk life and limb for the price of 5 health potions. I took my new follower into the sewers, where I admired the lighting and dead vagrants. I stumbled on a surprisingly beautiful new wave art installation and freed a handicapped woman from her prison. Despite her non-aggression, my new companion decided he wanted one less person collecting social security. My first interaction with Esbern reminded me of the unease I had felt in Delphine's basement. Both blades that I had encountered up until this point lived in basements, and were obsessed with Eastern mythology. But before I can complete the picture forming in my mind of the blade's true identity, I brought Esbern back to Delphine, and prepared for our journey to the blade's headquarters. On my journey, I encountered 2 creatures that tower over me during normal playthroughs. Both proved to be gentle giants, but even the most gentle of souls has limited patience for furries. I once again spotted Alduin getting up to no good, and I decided to start trouble in his neighborhood. At this point, I was able to handle weaker dragons with relative ease, and this particular dragon was no exception. The game must have sensed my confidence, because I was quickly met with a much bigger threat. An invisible blood dragon proved to be a worthy foe, but it fell just like all of its scaly brethren before. The rest of our trip to the Blade's home went smoothly. The vagrants camping outside the entrance were no match for my spicy hands. To the Blade's credit, their predecessors were excellent interior designers. The path to their base could easily compete for the best looking location in the game. But again, as I made my way through the mist-laden halls and ornately carved stone, I couldn't shake what felt like a dark cloud following me everywhere I went within the Blade's halls. It wasn't until I slipped out through the back door that I realized what felt so familiar about the Blade's aesthetics. The katana, the oriental architecture, the poor personal hygiene, the Blades are weebs, and for this reason, I was out. After my realization, I found the unorthodox mannerisms of the Greybeards to be more appealing, unwelcome creepy old man mist and all. From them I learned how to scream at clouds to make the dark times go away, an ability I wish I could use in real life. Despite my growing anticipation for my meeting with the coolest character in the game, I couldn't help but give in to a quick temptation. A well-known piece of trivia at this point in history, but still mind-blowing to me, is the fact that the voice of Mario coming from the dragon's throat could be so ethereal and, frankly, sexy. Of course, even the most sexy expedition dump can get boring. My mind quickly wandered to the top of the mountain. The tallest peak in Skyrim lends itself to a beautiful view, and helps justify VR's existence by simply existing. The College of Winterhold's bouncer gave me a nasty look, dripping with disdain for my perfect stature, but even height shaming couldn't sully the great mood I was in. The mining I had done off camera was about to pay off. Unlike a real university, I got my hands on a tangible reward for my work within the first few minutes of me stepping through its doors. The invisibility spell is a must-have for any aspiring wizard, or in my case, gnome, that prefers skirting around danger over facing it head-on. A combination of the muffle and invisibility spells makes your sneak skill moot, and saves your knees if you have physical sneaking turned on. I told a gaggle of horkers to simmer down and made my way to the admin of my least favorite Minecraft server. He abused his power by using creative mode right in front of me, so I went off to find another admin to report him to. Before I could do so, I discovered what, at first, seemed like an excellent way to grind the restoration skill. With healing hands and a follower, one could sit here for hours and heal whatever damage your follower takes. Of course, this is Skyrim, and nothing goes as planned. After applying aloe to Mercurio's burns for a few minutes, he became unresponsive, and I had to move on without him. Outside, I came across a dragon that must have learned how to fly from Doc Hudson. I abused the third dimension VR provides by reaching through a gate, and skipping a good chunk of boring underground adventures. The less Falmer that I have to deal with, the better. Skipping a decent chunk of the journey to Blackreach disrupted a story beat that I'm sure a writer over at Bethesda is genuinely proud of. But time is money, and I'm on a budget. Blackreach is a wonder to behold in VR, and making my way through it was a breeze thanks to a few previous purchases. A nice combo of the muffle and invisibility spell allowed me to traipse through Blackbeard's grand underground halls without having to worry about fighting some of the toughest enemies in the game. Robots, creepy crawlies, the whole lot of them didn't notice little old me as I made my way right past them. I just had to make sure to recast the invisibility spell every half minute or so, and I was set. None of the tunnel dwellers or Nordic crackheads paid me any mind, and before I knew it, I was a few feet away from the Elder Scroll. I made my way to the top of Big Weld's final resting place and started mashing buttons until the Elder Scroll exposed itself. The absurdity of grabbing such an ancient and powerful relic was not lost on me. All I cared about was getting back to Paarthurnax and catching the midnight release of my favorite Tamriel production, Old Man and the Scream. Alduin looked intimidating enough, but a quick scream had him on the ropes in minutes. He took his sweet time recovering from the can of whoop-ass he opened, and I made my way to Dragon's Reach after banishing him to Valheim. While waiting for the Jarl to wake up, I got my illusion up to the last level that matters. Talking to Lydia confirmed my theory that Mercurio was stuck down in that Dwemer labyrinth forever, and I was left without a follower for the rest of the run. Jarl Balgruff the Hater argued that his great hall, the hall named Dragon's Reach, couldn't capture a dragon, and I found myself starting the worst quest in the game. Geopolitics isn't my cup of tea, and while Skyrim's fantasy setting does add a bit of flair to a relatively boring storyline, I found the travel time between characters to be even more tedious in VR, and was reminded of why I tend to ignore the main questline during most of my playthroughs. As if the game meant to add insult to injury, the big meat that I had to orchestrate wouldn't start until I took my seat, and as one might guess, the Greybeards did not have a gnome-sized high chair on hand. I spent the next 20 minutes or so trying to entertain myself with an empty tankard, and listening to an argument that was only slightly interesting the first time I sat through it. To Skyrim's credit, it made me feel a type of boredom buried deep in my mind, one that I hadn't felt since the last time my mom said she would talk to her friend for 5 minutes at Target. Eventually, the conversation died down, and I made my way back to Dragon's Reach. Trapping a dragon was simple enough, and I was able to do so with minimal casualties. Still in awe of the scale of dragons, an awe that was compounded by my gnomish stature, I rode my new steed into the sunset. VRIK didn't agree with this decision, but I still enjoyed the flight. Thanks to the same spell combo I used back in Blackreach, I was able to slip by every Draugr I came across with ease. Without having to worry about fighting them, I felt a twinge of pity when I saw how weak their gains must have been after standing around abandoned crypts for hundreds of years. The last stretch was just as easy to sprint through, and I quickly found myself in the Nord's interpretation of the afterlife. I was in the endgame, and it was pretty. The fog was easy enough to dispense, and the bouncer turned out to be a major pushover. But the Grand Hall did disappoint me with its lack of grandeur. Sure, there was plenty of food and drink, but a complete lack of fine gnome women to spend the rest of eternity with was disappointing. The great Nord warriors of old whipped out their tried and true group howl, and an epic battle with Alduin ensued. And by epic battle, I mean a brief spat that ended as soon as it began. As I struck the killing blow on the most underwhelming final boss of all time, I answered the question that everyone still watching this video likely forgot about 10 minutes ago. Yes, you can beat Skyrim VR as a gnome. This run was fun, and being able to revisit one of my favorite games with a new perspective was refreshing. If you made it to this point in the video, thanks for swinging by. If you enjoyed this challenge, you should visit my Discord and suggest other challenges you would like to see, so that I can tell you how stupid you sound in a more personal setting.
This isn't over.